All right. Uh, Good evening. It seems you have complete attendance this evening, which is very encouraging. Yeah, it was a good thing that I did not schedule a class last week because that was because I had to record a lecture at the campus. They called it magisterial lectures, and the recording was supposed to be completed around 5 or 5:30, so that I don't think I would have been able to return in time for a 6 o'clock class. But it turned out to be also providential because internet connection just was busted in our neighborhood last week for about 7 days. Yeah, from Monday until this Sunday, it was finally restored this Sunday. So it should be. I hope this would be all right now for as long as we have to undergo our online classes. Okay, so let's proceed um, from where we left off. Okay, now if I recall clearly, the okay, I finished discussing here when we're talking here about levels of economic analysis. Okay, this would be in economics. I reviewed for you the definition of economics, that it's the social science that deals with the allocation of scarce resources among alternative uses to attain desired ends. And we have here the levels of economic analysis. Okay, microeconomic analysis would be the economic analysis of the behavior of the average individual unit, such as that of the average household, from which we then get the theory of the consumer and the theory of labor supply. Then the behavior of the average firm, from which we then get the theory of the firm and the theory of labor demand. Okay, and then the market structure, which is where households and firms interact. If it be perfectly competitive, a monopoly, imperfectly competitive, monopolistic competition, and we also discuss general equilibrium and welfare analysis. Okay, welfare in terms of the maximization of consumer surplus. Okay, and the producer surplus. Now, macroeconomics is the study of the economic behavior of aggregates. Okay, so you aggregate all consuming households, you get the consumption function. You aggregate all the firms, all their expenditures, you get the investment function. Then there's, of course, the total of government expenditures and government action. Then you have money, because money is the one commodity that is present in all transactions. It becomes macroeconomic analysis. Okay. Then, of course, there's the issue here of uh, total labor demand and total labor supply. Okay. Now, development, meanwhile, is the economic analysis of long-term change. Okay. And where where economic analysis usually focuses on the allocation of scarce resources, part of the area of study of development economics is how those resources increase over time. Okay, and development economics emerged in the 1950s. Okay, the discussion of developments in development economics, okay, is discussed fully well in chapter 3 of the Genre and Sadoleh. Okay, microeconomics, as you know, dates back to Alfred Marshall. Okay, his textbook principles of uh, economics uh, came out in 1890, and it became the most popular, most widely used textbook in economic analysis. It was the first uh, major textbook that used the word economics. Before that, it was known as political economy. And Alfred Marshall also incorporated, for the first time, mathematical analysis. He placed the mathematical analysis in the appendix of every chapter. Okay. Alfred Marshall, was a trained physicist, which is why he thought he could present the theories of economics using mathematics, and that was what he did. Little did he know that a few decades later, the major methodology of economic theory would be the use of mathematics. Okay. Macroeconomic theory, meanwhile, emerged in the 1930s. It was first developed by John Maynard Keynes. And it was John Maynard Keynes who redefined what used to be thought of as just the analysis of money, or what is nowadays known as monetary economics. Okay. And then the Keynesian model was refined by John Hicks in his Mr. Keynes and the Classics, Suggested Reinterpretation, which came out in 1939. That's where he extended Keynesian macroeconomics towards the ISLM model that John Hicks himself developed. Okay. Now, development economics emerged in the 1950s. Okay. This is because at the time in the 1950s, for the first time in modern human history, the majority of countries throughout the world were poverty-stricken countries. Okay, by the 1950s, most countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America had become independent. So they no longer were under the formal direct control of the colonial powers in Europe and in North America. So they were now all independent, and most of them were largely poverty stricken, which is why development economics emerged at the time because of the need to see what policies can be developed to bridge the gap between the living standards of the developed countries and the developing countries. And the other uh, motivation was, of course, much older. It is really to understand the processes of economic development. Okay. Much of political economy until the 1800s was really focused on long-term change. You can read that in Adam Smith, in the writings of Thomas Robert Malthus, David Ricardo to a degree, John Stuart Mill, definitely Karl Marx. They all studied long-term change, what we nowadays would think of as economic history. But this focus on economic history ended up being more or less no longer central to economics because of the emergence of micro and macroeconomics, both of which do substantial mathematical approaches to the study of economic issues, which is why in the 1950s, you now had a group of economists wanting once more to understand the process of economic development. So they decided to, among other things, go back to classical political economy to gain ideas and help develop theories that will try to explain the process of economic development. So that was the first generation of development economics, and that's when the subject matter of development economics emerged. Okay, we will be getting into that in greater detail in the next lecture. Okay, there have been other approaches since then. But for the meantime, what we'll be focusing on is on the issue of this gap in the standard of living between the developed countries and the less developed countries. Okay, and even that terminology requires some explanation. Okay, it used to be that in the 1950s countries were classified as being advanced and backwards. Okay, so by the 1960s, that was seen as being rather patronizing. So they now started to talk about the advanced countries and the emerging economies, which then, of course, begs the question emerging from what? It was in the 1970s when the term third world uh, first came up and unfortunately has remained to this day, even though it is already a completely irrelevant method of classifying countries. Okay? Um, the terminology third world comes from the fact that the first world countries were the high income industrialized economies of Western Europe, North America, and Japan. The second world were what at the time were called the Soviet bloc countries, okay, which would nowadays be Russia and the former Soviet republics, plus several Eastern European countries, including a portion of Germany, which is East Germany, where the Chancellor Angela Merkel was born and grew up. It was in the communist Eastern Germany that Angela Merkel grew up. And the Second World also included China. Okay, so they're all following what is known as being centrally planned economies. They were not market-based economies. They were centrally planned. So there was the government that makes decisions on everything. There wasn't much of a market. Okay, prices of all goods, of all commodities, wages, they were all fixed by government. And the allocation of resources, again, was done by government. They never followed market forces at all. Okay. I had a colleague who was in Shanghai in 1985 for 1 year the when the centrally planned economy was still not yet fully dismantled. And in fact, it was still very, very much the norm there. And she was telling me that Shanghai was classified as South, whereas Beijing, of course, that was the North. But Shanghai was already classified as South, even though it had very, very cold, bitter winters. What happened was the rule of the Chinese government was that the South does not receive any fuel for heating during the cold winter months. There was none. Okay, which is why she was saying that when she was give her lectures there, she was always wearing her very heavy overcoat. Okay, so that was the second world. So the third world will be all those countries not included, those that were none of the above. Okay, and the countries were, of course, generally low-income countries with high rates of poverty. And the idea of third world also brings with it the idea of being in a society where a lot of the institutions of government are backward. Okay. Now, of course, this categorization had lost its relevance by 1992, actually, when the Soviet Union collapsed and they ended up adopting the market economy. China fully adopted the market economy also by the 1990s. So really, there's no longer a second world. That's why it no longer makes sense to talk of any country as being first, but definitely not third world. There isn't any second world anymore. Okay? That's the reason I cringe whenever you have some people who keep on making reference to the Philippines as a third world country. I said, oh my God, those terms are so 1970s. In fact, in 1980s, again, the term third world was seen as quite patronizing. So when people were saying, why are they first? Why are we then third? Which is why from the 1980s onwards, among social scientists, among economists especially, they tend to just this they tend to just talk of countries as being developed and developing, or the more developed countries and the less developed countries. Okay, which is the terminology up to today. The more developed countries and the less developed countries. Okay. There's a time they'd also put the North and the South, but again, it's no longer quite relevant because North and South refer to the fact that the developed countries were very, very much in the northern temperate zone. Okay. But it's no longer relevant because Australia and New Zealand are in the south. And then you also have the emergence of Taiwan and Singapore. Okay. So the terminology of North and South, again, is no longer that relevant. It used to be also um, usong-uso in the 1980s, the North and the South. Okay. Nowadays, though, for technically qualified people, for people who'd like to show off their knowledge of the techniques of economic analysis, okay, they would know that countries would be classified as being high income, high income industrial, high income non-industrial, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income countries. Okay. And this is based upon the GNP per capita figures. And that is what we'll be discussing this evening, which is the measurement of economic development. Okay. And when development economics emerge, the focus, as I mentioned to you, one of the motivations was to narrow the gap in the standard of living between the advanced and the backward countries, to use 1950s terminology. Okay? So that's the concept. And of course, being a science, it needs to be measured. So therefore, um, what was the most widely used method of measuring the standard of living, the material standard of living? Okay. That would be the um, GNP accounting. Okay. whose origins are in Keynesian macroeconomics. Okay, John Maynard Keynes first developed the the aggregate demand equations. Okay, now macroeconomics, the GNP accounting is based upon a theory in macroeconomics, which is also present in classical monetary theory. And that is, it's the presumption that aggregate supply is always equal to aggregate demand. Okay? Aggregate supply is always equal to aggregate demand. Okay? And that's also the origin, you might say, of the two contrasting approaches to macroeconomic issues. You have the Keynesian approach that assumes that aggregate demand creates aggregate supply. Then there, of course, is the classical assumption, which is adopted by monetarism, which is that aggregate supply creates aggregate demand. Okay. As I will discuss with you later, so you have two approaches in macroeconomics, but in development economics, there are at least four major approaches. Again, because they have different starting assumptions. Okay. So in macroeconomics, the difference is simply if it's aggregate supply creating aggregate demand, or if it's aggregate demand creating aggregate supply. Okay. Neither position can be uh, fully tested. They are just a question of a starting assumption. It's whether you accept one or the other. Okay. The consensus in many is that Keynesian macroeconomics is useful for short-run economic analysis, and monetarist analysis would be useful for long-run economic analysis. Okay. So if we look at the GNP accounting, you have two equations on the aggregate demand side and one equation on the aggregate supply side. Okay. And the way the statistical methodology was developed, okay, um, all of these three equations are always equal. Okay, so on the aggregate demand side, you would have that GNP. By the way, it traditionally is called gross national product, but in the past 10 years, the World Bank now prefers to use GNI or gross national income, but they're the same because it's like I just was discussing with you, aggregate supply is always equal to aggregate demand. Okay, so on the demand side, there's the expenditure equation where GNP or GNI equals the sum total of consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports plus net factor income. Okay, net exports would be exports minus imports. Okay, which has been negative for most countries, especially developing countries, including the Philippines. And net factor income, which is the difference between the remittances, inward remittances of incomes from abroad minus remittances of incomes from the domestic economy going outwards. Okay. Net factor income is said to be positive for many developing countries, like the Philippines. This is the main source of accounting for the remittances of overseas workers. Okay. Developed countries, the net factor income tends to be negative. Okay. Now, the consumption is the sum total of expenditures of households. Investment is the sum total of expenditures by firms. And government is the sum total of expenditure by the government. Okay. For centralized governments like France, there's only just one accounting for government expenditure. But for federal countries like the United States of America, And also here in the Philippines, given that there is local autonomy, government expenditure is the sum total of expenditures by the national government and the local governments. Okay. Then the other aggregate demand equation is the income equation, okay, where the gross national product or gross national income is equal to the sum total of wages plus profit plus rent plus interest plus indirect business taxes and depreciation. Wage is the payment to labor as a factor of production. So all payments to labor would be put together in wage. Okay, as you know, my microeconomic analysis, wage is the payment for labor in terms of the laborer's physical capability. Okay. Now, people with education and skills are people with human capital. They would tend to have higher earnings given that their human capital is supposed to translate to greater productivity and therefore they get higher pay. So microeconomic analysis would separate, say, the wage data from the salary data because salaries is the payment for human capital. But on a macro level, they're all put together as wage, simply as the earnings to a human being, whether for his or her labor or his or her human capital, or both. Okay. Profit would be the earnings of business firms. Okay. Rent is the payment for those who own space, for those who own land or those who own space. Okay. And interest is the general term for all the earnings on financial assets. Okay. So this is on the demand side. On the supply side, you have gross national product, which is equal to the sum total of the gross value added of the production sectors. And there are 10 main production sectors, okay? They're agriculture, fishery and forestry. There's mining and quarrying. Then you have manufacturing. Then construction, electricity, gas and water, transport, storage and communication. Then trade, which is both wholesale and retail trade. So the SM department stores and superstores are here alongside the sari-sari stores, okay, because they're retail and wholesale trade are put together. Then finance, insurance, and real estate, or FIRE, F-I-R-E. Real estate here refers to the management of real properties that includes real estate brokers and the like, in contrast to construction, which involves the actual construction of buildings. Okay. Then you have services, okay? So education, finance, accounting, hotels and restaurants, lawyers, okay, and accountancy, entertainers. Okay. Then you have government. Okay, so these are the 10 main production sectors. And when you add the gross value added of each of these 10, you then get the gross national product using um, the aggregate supply approach. Okay, so it's the gross national product, which is the sum total of the gross value added. Okay, now all three of these equations are equal to each other because by theory, aggregate supply is also equal to aggregate demand. Okay, and that's why the income equation is also equal to the expenditure equation because all expenditure comes from income, and somebody's income would be someone else's expenditure, so they're all equal. That's why if you look at the data in the Philippine Statistical Authority, you will find data for all of these, including the individual elements. So you can find data on gross national product by expenditure shares. So there's data then consumption, investment, government spending. Then there is GNP by income share. So you have the data there for wage, profit, rent, and in the aggregate supply equation, you will find there the gross value added for each of these 10 sectors. Okay. Now, in the income equation, there is usually an element there called the statistical discrepancy. It is placed there in order to ensure that all three equations are equal. Okay. As long as the statistical discrepancy is no more than 5% of the total, then the estimation for the GMP is considered reliable. Okay? This only goes to show that estimation is never 100% accurate. So, given these equations, one can then further refine the equations to come out with additional concepts. Okay, so the classification of a country, whether high, low, middle income, and the like, is really based upon the country's GNP per capita. Okay, where GNP per capita is the country's total GNP divided by the population. Okay, now you have a number of concepts which were developed based upon the equations. So gross domestic product, for example, can be easily obtained by deducting net factor income from gross national product. Okay? So this would be a measure of the total level of domestic economic activity, domestic production, and the generation of incomes from domestic sources, okay? Which is very important for, especially for countries like the Philippines, where net factor income can be substantial, okay? So to get an idea of how the domestic economy is functioning, one uses the GDP, okay? Then if one were to deduct depreciation from gross national product, one then gets net national product. Okay. This is an important concept because when firms undertake expenditure, okay, they could be doing that for setting up new plants, new equipment, new factories, and the like. And they also spend on the maintenance of existing capital, existing machinery, equipment, and buildings. And this expenditure and the maintenance would be depreciation. The concept of net national product, therefore, is very important because if it turns out that depreciation expenditure would be greater than than the investment in new machinery, building, equipment, and the like, it suggests that the economy might be slowing down in the next couple of years because firms are not by and large investing in new plant, new equipment, new buildings, land improvements, and the like. So it is suggesting that the level of production overall might slow down because most of the expenditure of firms is going towards the maintenance of already existing capital. Okay. Then there is national income, which is net national product minus indirect business taxes, okay, which therefore equals to total wages plus rent plus interest plus profit. Okay. Now, national income, therefore, is the total of incomes earned by human beings based upon the factor of production that they have. Okay? So wage represents payment to labor as a factor of production, rent to land as a factor of production, interest to financial assets, and profit to businesses, to physical capital, and the like. Okay. Now, property income equals rent plus interest plus profit. Property income um, is earned by a minority in the population. One can have property income only if one owns property. If one owns land, one can get rent. If one owns financial assets, can get the interest. If one owns a business, if one owns equipment, machinery, and the like, one then earns a profit. So to be able to earn property income, one must own property. Now, the majority of the population earn wage. So this is one method of trying to measure or estimate uh, the distribution of income. Okay. Generally, it's said that property income ranges from 40 to 60% of total national income. Okay. Now, the GNP uses money valuation in order to measure uh, economic activity, which is the money value of goods and services when they are being exchanged. Okay. And the value of money changes. Okay. The purchasing power of money changes over time. Okay. So that is why, in order to remove the effects of inflation, of the loss of purchasing power, okay, one needs to develop a particular concept by which one can measure how much economic activity increased by removing as well the effect due to the loss of purchasing power. So we're talking about the concept of real GNP. Real GNP is nominal GNP. Nominal GNP is the GNP value using the money prices in a given year. So it's nominal GNP divided by the GNP deflator. Okay. The GNP deflator is an index that indicates the increase in the general level of prices from the base year. Okay. So here in the Philippines, our current base year, if I'm not mistaken, is about 2005. Okay. So when you have, say, the nominal GNP for 2020, that would be the sum total of the value of goods and services produced in 2020 using 2020 prices. Okay. Now, to get the real GNP, you get the index. The index is a number that indicates by how much price levels have changed from 2005 to 2020. So that becomes the GNP deflator. Okay. So you then get what's called real GNP. In the Philippine Statistics Authority, it usually is presented in a table called nominal GNP is presented as gross national product at current prices. So you have data there from 1947 to 2020. And for each year, they use the prices of those years. Okay. And then there's another table that indicates GNP, real GNP, which is usually presented as GNP at constant prices of 2005, okay, which means that the deflator okay, used the prices of 2005 as the base year. Okay. If you want to make a long-term historical analysis, note that they keep on changing the base years. Okay. Previous to 2005, they used 1995. Previous to 1995, they used 1975. Okay. Now, there's a reading who by Dr. Noel de Guzman, who explains the nitty-gritty of real and nominal GNP, right? You'll find that worthwhile. Okay. So this is how we then get real GNP. And then at the same time, here's the thing. Okay. Countries are different from each other. Very, very different. And one area by which they're very different is the size of their population. Okay. The Philippines has the world's 13th largest population, a population of about 110 million. China has the largest population, about 1.3 billion. India is very close at 1.2 billion. Okay? And the United States is around 310 million. And Indonesia, about 280 million. Okay? You have countries like Malaysia with a population of just 28 million, which is about the population of the Visayas. Okay. And then, of course, there's Singapore with a population of about 7 million, which is lesser than the population of Metro Manila, which is about 11 million already. Okay. So countries do vary a lot, especially in terms of their populations. So for cross-country comparisons, two things would need to be done. Okay. You need to divide the country's total GNP with the population in order to get what is called GNP per capita, okay, or gross national product or gross national income per head. And then, since the gross national product is measured using the country's currency, okay, to make it comparable across countries, you convert it in terms of an internationally accepted currency. Okay? So you then get GNP per capita in US dollars, the nominal GNP per capita in US dollars, by converting the GNP figures using the official exchange rate. Okay? So can you all please excuse me for a few minutes? I need to answer the call of nature. All right, we're back. You'll be expecting these regular short breaks because it seems at my age it's already getting to be a bit of a problem now. Right. So okay, so let's proceed. Okay. So once you get your GNP data in nominal US dollar value terms, it means the GNP expressed in US dollars using the official exchange rate. Okay. And the GNP in US dollars is not just the GNP per capita, it can be the entire GNP and the individual elements on the demand and on the supply side, which is why one can then make cross-country comparisons, not just in terms of GNP per capita, but even in terms of their specific components. Okay? That's why one can compare what's known as the structure of economies. One can compare, for example, based on GNP per capita, the share of consumption to total GNP, the share of investment to total GNP, the share of net exports to total GNP. It is said that countries like Japan, China, have a very high share of investment to total GNP and net exports to total GNP. In contrast, uh, the United States, Canada, Western European countries tend to have higher consumption to GNP shares. Okay. And it's also using the GNP per capita, US dollar nominal value, that you can then classify countries. Okay. Countries are classified as high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, lower income. Okay, so that is based upon the GNP per capita data. Okay. Now, GNP per capita GNP accounting is actually very recent. The earliest GNP data was tried by Simon Kuznets for the US economy in 1934, but he never completed it, nor was it repeated. Okay. But the first complete GNP accounting was done for the United Kingdom in 1939. Okay, for those of you who are fond of history, okay, and who watched films like Dunkirk, okay, you know that in 1939 was the start of World War II when the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Okay. And the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom then had an allocation problem. He had to find out how much money he can set aside for the war effort in terms of direct military expenditures. But he also needed money to maintain the food supply in the country, which is why he needed to obtain figures. And so by the end of 1939, government statisticians had developed the first complete set of GNP data. Okay, the US GNP data would be completed about 1942. The Philippines has one of the earliest countries to have our own GNP data. So that would be from 1947. Okay, which is why it used to be that you have a lot of commentators saying that in 1950 the Philippines was second only to Japan. Okay. That's because in 1950 only Japan, the Philippines, and India had GNP data. Okay. So you say we're the second only to Japan in all Asia in 1950. In all Asia, only Japan, the Philippines, and India had GNP data. The other countries didn't have GNP data yet. Okay, Thailand will get its GNP data around 1956. Okay, Malaysia and Singapore were not independent in 1950, so they would only do GNP accounting when they became independent. Okay, so Singapore's GNP data started from 1965, Malaysia around 1958. Okay. South Korea was at war in 1950. They could not do any GNP accounting. Okay. And Indonesia also did not learn of how to do the GNP accounting until 1953 or so. So were we really second to Japan in all Asia in 1950? We don't know because most of the other countries didn't have GNP data. Okay. Now, GNP data is done every quarter. It appears every quarter. Okay. And it's now widely used in most countries throughout the world. Nearly all member countries of the World Bank have GNP data. Okay. And it therefore makes it very, very convenient for cross-country comparisons, especially since the methodology is standardized. Okay. The methodology, which I just discussed with you, is set in a document known as the United Nations System of National Accounts, the UNSNA. Okay. Now, the what was I going to say? Sorry. Oh, population data, meanwhile, uh, is done only during a census year. Okay, and censuses are not done every year because it's very expensive to do. That's why it's only done during a census year, which is why population data are only accurate in a census year. Okay, outside of census years, between census years, population data therefore is a linear interpolation. So here in the Philippines, our census year since independence would be in 1947. It was done in 1947 because the country became independent in 1946. So they wanted to find out already what was the population of the Philippines. Okay, so they decided not to do any in 1950, and then the next was 1960, 1970, 1980. Every year that ends in zero was a census year. So last year was a census year. If there were enough resources, so they might want to do what's known as an off-census count. Okay, the off-census years are 1975, 1995, 2007, and 2015. Okay, so the population data for these years are the ones that are accurate. Okay, so say the population data for 2013, therefore, is a linear interpolation between the figures for 2000 and 2015. The current population figure, therefore, is an estimate from the 2015 census. Okay, it will of course change once the 2020 data appear. Okay, now the US dollar exchange rate, of course, is not determined by the Philippine dealing system. Okay, and there is minute by minute data available on transactions in the Philippine dealing system. It has been the one determining the official exchange rate since about 1993, 1992, 1993, when the foreign exchange market was liberalized. Okay. Okay, so this GNP data, therefore, is widely used. It's widely available for most countries. And it's been available for several years for all sovereign countries. And that's why the GNP data is the one most widely used in terms of describing and classifying countries. Okay. It's based upon the GNP data, as I mentioned, that you determine if a country is high income, middle income, lower middle income. Okay. The Duterte administration was hoping that by 2020, we would become an upper middle income country because our GNP per capita was already near the cut-off income level to become an upper middle income country. But the pandemic did not make it possible. In fact, we are now far away from that because of the negative growth of 2020. They're no longer aiming at being an upper middle income country, which has some benefits to it. Once you're upper middle income country, the interest rate on loans from commercial banks tend to go down, but you lose access to a lot of the loans of international multilateral institutions like the World Bank, ADB, you no longer are able to avail of what are known as the concessional interest rates of these loans because they are upper middle income. Okay, so there are pros and cons to that. Okay, so so those are the uses, therefore, of GNP accounting. But now we'll have to look at the limitations, meaning to say what GNP data, GNP accounts cannot ever try to measure and the like. Okay. So there are intrinsic limitations, meaning to say the very nature of GNP accounting, some things it cannot measure. Okay. First is that it cannot measure income distribution. Okay. One needs a separate method of measuring income distribution. Okay. So you can have a country like Mexico with a GNP per capita in US dollar terms higher than a country like Sri Lanka. But the average household in Sri Lanka might have a higher standard of living compared to the average household in Mexico, even though Mexico has the higher GNP per capita. And that's because Mexico has a much more inequitably distributed income compared to Sri Lanka. So, but GNP data do not give an idea of the degree of income distribution. Therefore, it does not give one an idea of the standard of living, of what the standard of living of the average household might be like. Okay. And then non-monetized transactions are excluded. Okay. For as long as there is no exchange of money, it will be very difficult to measure. Okay. And that's why the classic example here would be the work of housewives. They're not measured because in many countries here in the Philippines included, a housewife does not get a salary, even though housewife or already house husbands as well do a valuable service of managing the house, okay, of buying food, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, and the like. Okay, these are very, very valuable service, but because of the nature that they're not being paid to do that, then that is not included in the GNP. Now, if there were household help, the salaries of the household help, if registered, would be included in GNP accounting. So there is some measure of the value of housekeeping. Okay. And also it is said that in the 1990s onwards, okay, the GNP of the United States of America increased rapidly, but it may not have represented an increase in the actual level of production because the argument was that from 1990s onwards, more and more households in the USA no longer were cooking at home, but rather just buying food. So effectively, what used to be done free at home ended up being monetized because they're now being purchased outside. But it may not have represented an actual increase in the level of production. Okay. So the more monetized transactions there are, the more gross national product accounting can accurately measure the level of production in a certain economy and the like. Okay. Volunteer work, for example, is not included because there isn't any data there on wages because that's the reason why they're called volunteers. They're not being paid a wage. Okay? And when you have a lot of volunteer activity happening in a certain country, it means there's a good deal of production and service being produced, but they're not being included in GNP because there is no wage being paid. Okay. Then another intrinsic limitation is that GNP accounting, just like the census, population census, and the like, okay, these are government activities. So automatically it means that illegal activities cannot be included, which would be a problem mainly if there are a lot of illegal activities. Okay, so and the further complicating factor is that what is illegal in some countries may be legal in other countries. Okay, so for example, commercial sex work is illegal in the Philippines, along with the production and sale of narcotics. In many European countries, commercial sex is already legal, so that the earnings of commercial sex workers and the earnings of those engaged in the production of pornographic materials and the like, those are included in their GNP, but not here in the Philippines. Okay? And also in the Netherlands, Portugal, they've already licensed a number of establishments for the regulated sale of cocaine. Okay, those sales and the salaries of those involved in those industries become part of their GNP, but not here in the Philippines because it's considered illegal here. Okay, so effectively, the less the number of illegal activities in a country, then the more accurately can GNP measure the level of production in a certain country, in a certain society. Okay, now the there are certain limitations, though, when applied to developing countries. Okay. One of them was an argument put forward by the Burmese economist Lamien, who said that there are real differences among countries. For example, it is said that most of the developed countries are the northern hemisphere. They're in the temperate zone. Okay, North America, Europe, Japan, they're in the northern temperate zone. Australia, New Zealand in the southern temperate zone, where they do have very wide temperature differences in a given year. Which is why it is said that for people in these countries, they have to spend a lot more on having two sets of clothing, one for warmer seasons, the other for the colder seasons, and they also have to spend a lot on heating. This higher level of expenditure may not necessarily reflect a genuine difference in the standard of living. It might just reflect a real difference. Okay? Because for many countries in the tropics, including the high income country like Singapore, you don't need two sets of clothing in a given year, nor do you need to spend on heating. Okay? But you see, these real differences cause consumption patterns to be very, very different. So they may not necessarily reflect a higher standard of living, but just a real difference. Okay. Another has to do with the fact that some countries would have what is known as multiple use zoning, whereas countries like the United States of America, Canada, they tend to have what is known as single use zoning. Okay. When you have single use zoning, it means certain areas in cities are just residential. Okay. And the commercial establishments are located elsewhere, and the same with offices and the like. Okay. The effect of that, it is said, is that it means that for many residents, they have to spend a lot on transport every day, especially since the residential area is located away from the commercial center. And if most of the residential areas or low density housing, it would mean that all the houses spread out. So therefore, there's a long distance from many houses towards the commercial centers, towards the office centers, towards schools and the like. So on a daily basis, they have to spend on transport, and therefore it pushes their consumption expenditure. But in many countries in Europe and in Japan, okay, they follow more or less what's known as multiple use zoning, meaning to say there are residential units alongside commercial establishments, schools, and the like in the city centers. Okay. And most of their buildings would be several levels, allowing for a lot of residential units in the upper floors, commercial units in the ground floor, and the like. Which is why you will notice this in many sitcoms set in New York City, like How I Met My Mother, where a lot of, or Friends, the people there would just walk from their residential unit, which is usually an apartment in the upper level, and they just walk to restaurants, to shopping centers, to their place of work. And for some, the place of work would involve a very, very short ride on the public transport system. So their daily transport expense is not very high. Okay. So again, this might reflect more of a real difference rather than a difference in the standard of living. Okay. The next limitation in less developed countries is the fact that the characteristic of less developed countries is the presence of an informal sector, a large informal sector, which I'll be discussing later when I talk about structural issues, structural theories of economic development. Okay. Suffice it to say that the informal sector is the sector in the economy that is not integrated with the modern sector. It does not have any integration in terms of the transport, communication systems, energy, water supply, sanitation systems, and the like. Okay? We know of the informal sector here in the Philippines as those in the squatters area, where that is supposed to be a residential area, but there's a lot of businesses going on there. Okay, so that the residence is already a place of work. They have beauty parlors, repair establishments, vulcanized sink shops, furniture, furniture making, furniture repair, food processing activities, okay, dressmaking establishments. And these are all informal sector businesses. They're not registered with government. Okay. Um, if we go back, I'm sorry. Okay, these individual elements in GNP are actually obtained from business establishments. So consumption expenditures obtained from business establishments. So it's investment. They check the total investment expenditure of business firms. Okay. Net exports data is obtained also from those firms that engage in exports and imports. Net factor income data is obtained from banks. Okay. Wage, profit, rent, interest paid, and indirect taxes paid, and depreciation expenditure are also obtained from business firms. And the gross value added data are also obtained from the business firms in all these different production sectors. But in the informal sector, the businesses there are not registered. That's why it's difficult to obtain data from them on their investment expenditure, their wages being paid, and the like, which is why it is said that for developing countries, the informal sector cannot be included in their GNP, and therefore the GNP underestimates the actual level of production and income being generated in the economy. Okay, we'll be discussing the issue later. Why is it that there's an informal sector? In fact, again, that's a characteristic of developing countries. Okay. Then you have also what are known as the valuation of non-traded goods. Okay. Non-traded goods are goods which cannot be traded across borders because they're simply too expensive. Okay. Non-traded goods tend to be services and infrastructure. Okay, by services, it does not make sense for a person to fly to Hong Kong or New York just for a haircut. Okay, the value of that service is so much so smaller than the transport cost. So there's no sense in doing that. So services, they're a form of non-traded goods. The other form of non-traded goods are infrastructure because they're fixed in place. Okay, you cannot live in a city like Metro Manila and enjoy the subway train network of Hong Kong. Cannot it because they're fixed in place. So you cannot trade the the mass transit service of Hong Kong with that of Manila and vice versa. Okay. Traded goods are goods that can be imported and exported. It's a wide range of them, from mangoes, shirts, jewelry, electronic gadgets, and the like. Okay. Now, the issue with non-traded goods is this. In developed countries, traded and non-traded goods have a value which are quite close to each other. Okay. In less developed countries, traded goods have a value which are close to their international prices, but non-traded goods tend to have a much lower value than traded goods. Which is why it is said that when you sum up the traded and non-traded goods, money valuation, developing country GDP or GNP data again underestimates the actual level of production activity precisely because of the very, very low value of non-traded goods. Okay. Finally, you have the issue here of the official exchange rate. With the official exchange rate, the inaccuracy has to do with the fact that some countries historically have either overvalued or undervalued the exchange rate. Okay. Here in the Philippines, the official exchange rate has largely been determined by the foreign exchange market, by the demand and supply of foreign exchange. And that's done in the Philippine dealing system. Okay. But this liberalization, as they call it, dates back only from 1993. Okay. Before that, it is said that the Philippine exchange rate was actually pegged or determined by the then Central Bank of the Philippines. Okay, it is said that Philippine officials in the Philippines tended to overvalue the exchange rate, whereas countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China have tended to undervalue their exchange rate. Overvaluation would be, say, like right now, the Philippines has an exchange rate of 48 pesos to $1. The overvaluation would mean, say, 40 pesos to $1. And automatically, what this means is it makes imported goods cheaper. They would be cheaper at 40 to 1 rather than at 48 is to 1. Okay. That's why they said that countries that overvalued their exchange rates were countries that had to control the domestic inflation that could be caused by the fact that they are importing a strategic commodity. Okay. And previously, that was imported petroleum, because the Philippines before 1993 was heavily dependent on imported petroleum for its energy requirements. Okay? We are no longer that dependent any longer. Much of our energy is now sourced from geothermal, hydroelectricity, coal, and the like. So we no longer are highly dependent on imported petroleum for our energy requirements. It's largely used for the transport system. Okay. On the other hand, countries that have undervalued their exchange rate, like Japan, South Korea, China, and the like, would mean that rather than the Philippine peso set at 48 pesos to $1, it will be, say, 60 pesos to $1, which automatically means imported goods become very expensive. But it also means that domestically produced goods would have a much lower export price. And so that's why it is said that countries that have historically undervalued their exchange rates mean that they're trying to promote their export industries. Okay. And it is said that China is doing it up to now. So what would be the main problem insofar as the valuation is concerned? It's said that overvalued exchange rates tend to overestimate the dollar value of their GNP, whereas undervalued exchange rates tend to underestimate the dollar value of their exchange rates. It's for this reason that one uses supplemental or modified measures to make comparisons across countries. Okay, and so here are the proposed alternatives. Okay, one is that there are those that focus on consumption per capita. Okay, because it said that really when you're talking about the standard of living, it has to do with what households are actually able to directly experience, and that is their consumption expenditure. Okay, which is why there are many instances where comparisons across countries would involve the use of the consumption per capita rather than GNP per capita. Then there have been attempts at measuring what are known as the social wage, okay, where the social wage concept is the argument that uh, average households actually obtain a wide range of services beyond what their wage would entail. So social wage is an attempt to measure that. It includes the wage. Wage is the sum total of earnings of the majority of the population. But in addition to wage, you have transfer payments, meaning to say these are payments that have nothing to do with one's productivity. They are provided for by private employers. Okay. So examples of transfer payments would be health insurance provided by employers. Okay. There's the rice allowance. There's a rice allowance in Ateneo, which right now comes up to the peso value of 5 kilos. 5 kilos of bigas. 5 kilos ba? 5 kilos. Yeah, I think so. It's about five. Yeah, 5 kilos a month. Okay. So whether you are Professor Alvin Ang or Professor Mahalea Ravago, we get the same rice allowance. Okay. And it has nothing to do with your productivity level at all, unlike the wage, which is based upon your productivity level. Okay. But the thing is about these transfer payments is that they do stretch the standard of living more than what the wage provides for. Then you have government transfer payments. Government transfer payments are directly coming from government, regardless of, again, regardless of whether one is working for it or not. The usual forms of government transfer payments would be um, pensions, pensions for the elderly and for those people with disability. Okay. Then the conditional cash transfer is also a form of a government transfer payment. So these things do stretch once more the standard of living of wage earners. Then add to this government expenditure on consumption expenditures, which would be government expenditure on things that are available in the market, but government spends on these, so they become affordable to the lower income classes. So you're talking here about government expenditure on healthcare, in terms of PhilHealth, government expenditure in the public education system. Okay? And you also have government expenditure in housing. Okay, there are a number of housing projects, usually by local government units, but also by the national government. Not very many, unfortunately, but there are available. Okay. So once more, these expenditures by government stretch the standard of living of wage earners. And then you deduct taxes, of course, because a lot of the government transfer payment and government expenditure on consumption items are paid for by taxes. So therefore, this concept will give one an idea of the degree of the, the standard of living that wage earners in the country might be enjoying. Okay? Because one deducts taxes paid. If the total of social wage is negative, it means that wage earners are actually paying more in taxes than receiving benefits from their taxes. Okay. In contrast, if social wage were positive, then that they are enjoying more than what they're paying for in terms of taxes. So there's a greater deal of distribution of income in favor of wage earners. Then you have what's called the purchasing power parity adjustment. Okay. The purchasing power parity adjustment is a method of dealing with the problem of the valuation of non-traded goods and the use of the official exchange rate. Purchasing power parity adjustment is an index number. Okay, it is based upon the theory that says that the exchange rate under perfectly competitive foreign exchange market conditions, the exchange rate is supposed to reflect the parity in the purchasing power of the two currencies. So therefore, when the exchange rate of the Philippine peso to the US dollar is 48 pesos to 1 US dollar, if there was purchasing power parity, it means that what $1 can purchase in the US, 48 pesos can purchase in the Philippines. Okay. But of course, that's not the case. Okay, that's not the case. And that's why the purchasing power parity adjustment indexes were computed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so that from 1990 onwards, you now have what are known as US dollar figures purchasing power parity adjusted, the PPP adjusted US dollar figures. Okay, so that onto the nominal US dollar figures, this index number is applied. Okay. Now, the PPP was based upon the measurement they did throughout all countries in the world by obtaining what would be the local price for a commodity, local prices for a commodity that is common to all societies. Okay. And the commodity that's common to all societies is carbohydrates. Okay. So to obtain the PPP adjustment factor, what they did was to measure, say, well, the World Health Organization has certain nutritional standards. So they say that any individual must obtain this much kilocalories of carbohydrates daily to fulfill minimum nutritional requirements. Okay, so what happens is in every society, this kilocalories of carbohydrates is converted into a certain quantity of the most common source of carbohydrates in that country. In the Philippines here, it's NFA bigas. In the USA, it is white bread. So they get the quantities of these, okay, in terms of their kilocalories, and they get the local price, okay? The local price for so many kilocalories of NFA bigas and the US dollar price of so many kilocalories of white bread. And they take that ratio, and that becomes the PPP adjustment factor. And that is done for all countries throughout the world. Okay. So the US dollar values of figures from the USA do not change since the US dollar is the numeraire. But for individual countries, they do change. So what happens is that for countries like Japan and many European countries, the PPP adjusted US dollar figures tend to go down. Okay. Whereas here in the Philippines, the PPP adjusted factor would tend to go up. Yeah. Mm. So what happens is that the Philippine GNP per capita of about 1,000 US dollars or so would become 3,000, 3,500 PPP adjusted. Okay, it merely reflects the fact of much much lower prices here for non-traded goods. Okay, so when you do have comments that say that China now has a larger economy than the USA, that is based upon the PPP adjusted value of China's GNP. Okay. So, which is why nowadays, when you're going to um, compare across countries, you have to check your data. The World Bank provides data for all member countries on the local currency unit values of their GNP. Kaya yung Philippine GNP there, if it's in LCU, then those figures are in Philippine pesos. Then you have the Chinese figures, which are in Chinese yuan renminbi. Then there's the Singapore and Singapore dollar values and the like. Okay. For comparison, you need to look at what is known as the PPP adjusted US dollar figures. Okay, the comparison across countries becomes more accurate if you use PPP adjusted US dollar values. In contrast, the nominal US dollar values of GNP are important usually for those in finance because that is the exact dollar figures that people have. Okay, we don't have 3,850 US dollars PPP adjusted. We do have $1,200, which is the nominal value of the GNP per capita of the country. Okay. Finally, you have the concept known as entitlements. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, the use of GNP data meant that for a long, long time, therefore, the focus of the anti-poverty measures and development programs and like and also the focus of analysis was in the differences in the GNP per capita of countries and how the GNP per capita the gap can be reduced over time. And therefore, an indicator of a country that is becoming more and more developed is that this country's GNP per capita figure is increasing over time. Amartya Sen, however, the Nobel economist from India, argues that the use of income based notion of development is very, very limiting. Okay. Rather, he would say that in addition to income data, one needs to look at the entitlements available in a certain society. Okay. He argues that entitlements are the bundle or the set of goods and services available to the average household in a certain country. And he says that economic development is actually the process of not just increasing GNP per capita over time, it's also the process of increasing the entitlements over time. Okay. So that the country becomes more and more of a developed country if there are more and more entitlements available to the average household in that community. In developed countries, for example, they do have ready access to emergency assistance. Okay? In the United States, it would involve a call to 911. In Europe, a call to 2222. Here in the Philippines, even for the highest income households, emergency relief assistance is not available. There are localized emergency relief assistance, but there's no national emergency relief uh, assistance. Okay, so that's the reason why in the USA, like you can have a lot of these extreme sports events and like because in case of emergency, they can easily call 911. It would be very, very dangerous to do that here in the Philippines. Okay, because in case something happens, what emergency relief assistance do you get? What happens is they would have to make sure that there's a Red Cross facility available, okay, which is very costly because that means that the Red Cross facility could not be doing other things even when there's emergency going on. Unlike if there's an emergency relief assistance, Red Cross or any other emergency would only come if there is the need for it. Okay, but there is not no such mechanism in developing countries. Okay, Sen, for example, in his article compares China and India. This was written in early 1980s. So China and India in the 1970s were still very, very comparable in terms of their level of economic development at that time. And they were the largest largest populations then as now in the whole world. Okay. Sen noted that in China, there's a much lower rate of malnutrition than in India. So he says that uh, proper nutrition is an entitlement of the average household in China. China at that time still had a command economy. So they're able to guarantee minimum nutritional standards for the majority of the population. Whereas in the case of India, they had a market economy insofar as the food distribution is concerned. And what happens is they have very, very high rates of malnutrition. They have a lot of obese people, but they have very, very many were completely malnourished. Okay. So proper nutrition is an entitlement of the average household in China, but not in India. However, in contrast, Sen notes that whenever there is a natural calamity, India had a much lower rate of fatalities than China. Both countries are subjected to similar levels of natural calamities. China experiences typhoons and floods and earthquakes. India also experiences typhoons, they call it monsoons, and therefore the attendant flooding and also earthquakes and the like. And Sen noted that India had a much lower rate of fatalities whenever there are natural calamities compared to China. He attributes that to the fact that India had the entitlement of a free press, which China then as now does not have. Okay? And it's especially highlighted in the beginnings of the coronavirus crisis when they were suppressing information coming from Wuhan. The effect of having a free press was that uh, information can easily spread with regards to the location of survivors and victims. So therefore, by this information spreading very, very quickly, both government and non-government groups can now act in order to help the survivors and help recover the victims. So it is said that the free press is an entitlement of India, which is not present in China. And that's why these two countries are both developing. So to become developed, their entitlements should also increase over time, where both can have a free press that can help guarantee lower rates of fatalities during major calamities, and that they can also each have guaranteed minimum nutrition for their average household. Okay? Which is why right now, in addition to looking at GNP per capita, it's always worthwhile for those who want to study development to look at the level of entitlements. Okay, if the entitlements are increasing over time, and what the entitlements are to compare entitlements across countries. Okay, now um, the other topic that is closely related to to the measurement of the standard of living is the issue of poverty. This will be the last topic for this evening. I would be over by 8 p.m. I cannot go on anymore. So when you now talk of poverty, okay, there are actually very, very many concepts and approaches to the issue of poverty, and one has to be aware of that. Okay. So I'll be looking at the most common and the most widely focused notions of poverty and the data associated with them. So they're the absolute poverty, relative poverty, poverty as social exclusion, and self-rated poverty. Okay. Now, absolute poverty, okay, is a concept in which there's a certain threshold level of income, and those households whose incomes fall below that would be a certain type of poor, absolutely. The data for this comes from what is known as the Family Income and Expenditure Survey, or FIES. The FIES is done every 3 years since 1985. Okay. It involves a very, very detailed survey of 30,000 household respondents. And it's very, very detailed. They answer their sources of income and what their expenditure patterns are and the like. Okay. So it's based upon the FIES data that they're able to determine and measure absolute and relative poverty levels. So if you look first at absolute poverty levels, okay. Now, there is what's known as the destitution threshold. Okay. Again, the destitution threshold uh, is the income level that the average household would need to earn in a given year in order to satisfy minimum daily carbohydrate requirement for each member of the household. Okay. So as I mentioned a while ago, the minimum daily carbohydrate requirement is based upon the World Health Organization standards that the average human being must consume so many kilocalories of carbohydrates a day. So these kilocalories of carbohydrates will then be converted into a certain quantity of NFA bigas. Okay? And then one obtains the price for this quantity of NFA bigas, okay, times 6 times 365. Times 6 is the average sized household in the Philippines. 365 would be the days in the year. So when you put them together, this is what is known as the destitution threshold. Okay, the peso income that a household would need to have in order to satisfy the average household would need to earn in order to satisfy the minimum daily carbohydrate requirements for every member of the household. Okay. So those whose incomes fall below these are classified as destitute. So they're below the destitution threshold. Okay. Now, the next type of level is the food threshold. Now, this would require that they earn more because they would have to satisfy not just the carbohydrate requirement, but the protein requirement. Okay. There's a minimum daily protein requirement recommended by the World Health Organization, which can then be converted into the most common source of protein in a society. In the 1980s and 1990s, here in the Philippines, they tended to track the prices of tuyo and bagoong. Okay, so one obtains the prices of tuyo and bagoong whose quantity fulfills the minimum daily protein requirement. So with this peso amount of tuyo and bagoong, again multiplied by 6 and 365, and it's added to the destitution threshold, then you get what is known as the food threshold, the income needed by the average household in order to satisfy minimum daily carbohydrate and protein requirement. Those whose incomes fall below the food threshold would therefore be called food poor. They're not able to fulfill minimum daily food requirements. Okay. And the food poor automatically include the destitute. Okay. Now, beginning the year 2000, there's been a change in the method of determining the food threshold. Okay. Now, what they track would be the ingredients that go into the most common ulam, such that that ulam, when cooked, plus the NFA bigas, would total 2,000 calories a day. Okay? Which is really not much since a happy meal is already roughly 800 calories. And that's just one meal. Okay, so 2,000 calories a day is not that much. So since the year 2000, this is how they measure the food threshold. So those whose income levels are below the food threshold, they would be classified as being food poor. Okay. Then you have the total or basic needs threshold. This would be the income level needed by the average sized household in order to satisfy the basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So the food is measured by the food threshold. To this, you add the, the value of 2 sets of clothing, which is, of course, what they need in a year, and the rental on the average size shelter in a particular community. Okay, and the average size shelter is very small throughout the country. Okay. So put these together. You have the total or basic needs threshold, the income level needed by the average household to satisfy minimum daily food, clothing, and shelter requirements. So those whose income levels fall below this are said to be poor. And this percentage is the most widely quoted poverty incidence information. Okay. So when one talks of focusing on the poverty incidence is this: the percentage of households whose incomes fall below the total or basic needs threshold. Okay. The incidence for destitution, food, and total or basic needs have decreased from 1985 up to 20. The last time that they did the FIS, I think, is 2015. There's been a declining trend, but the poverty incidence is still quite substantial. Here in the Philippines is still above 20%. Okay. It was at its highest in 1985, and it was 59%. Now, in terms of international comparison, however, the poverty incidence data is done by all countries, but it is not easily comparable. Okay, there you have a reading there from the Asian Development Bank, which shows that it's not really comparable because, for example, the paper argues that some countries do not put too much into their food estimation. And in some countries, a rental, like in China, a lot of low-income households receive free rental, which is why for cross-country comparisons, the World Bank prefers to use what's known as the dollar a day and the $2 a day incidence. Okay, it's what happens is they try to check what's the percentage of households whose incomes fall below $1 a day and those whose incomes fall below $2 a day. I think they've adjusted it lately. It's now 115 and 215. But this data is available in the World Bank and it allows for, again, a much more straightforward method of comparing poverty incidence across countries. Okay. So if you're going to do your research and make comparisons in terms of poverty incidence, okay, keep in mind again the limitations of using the poverty incidence data of individual member countries as opposed to using what is known as the dollar a day and the $2 a day threshold. Okay. Now, relative poverty. Relative poverty now measures the distribution of income. Okay. Income data is available, but wealth data is not completely available. Okay. The FIS data will show to you that the 10% of the households in the Philippines earn 40 to 60% of total national income. Okay. But there's no such data to support an argument that 10% of the households own 90% of the wealth. That's because there is no wealth data. Okay. The part of wealth data that's difficult to estimate is the human capital figure. Okay? The total level of total financial assets can be obtained. It's usually measured by M3 or M2. Okay. Now, it's possible to obtain the total value of real estate in the country. So that gives you an idea of the total value of land. So financial assets and land. Then again, you can also get the total value of, of equipment, machinery, buildings, land improvements owned by business firms. So that represents capital. The problem, though, is measuring human capital. Okay. The UN has made some attempts already in order to measure human capital, but its monetary valuation is difficult. Okay. Um, They can only go as far as establishing, say, the average number of years completed per country. Okay? But they have difficulty completing the monetary valuation. And it's also difficult to obtain the per capita figure. Okay? There is a close relationship between income and wealth because income is essentially a capitalization of the wealth that one owns. Okay? So, for example, if one does not have any wealth, one simply earns a wage. But if one owns financial assets, you get interest. If you own land, you get rent. If you own business, if you own capital, machinery, equipment, and the like, you get profit. Okay. And if you have human capital, then you earn a salary. But uh, measuring human capital is a problem. That's why there isn't much data on wealth. So there is data on income. Okay. Now, relative poverty is measured using the Lorenz curve and the corresponding Gini ratio. Okay. Data from the Family Income and Expenditure Survey can be so organized that all the households can be grouped into 10, okay, or into 10. So you have the highest 10%, the 10% of the households with the highest income, and the 10% of the household with the lowest income levels. Okay, so the 10% of the household with the lowest income levels would be usually the first decile. Okay, the 10% of the households that have the highest income would be the 10th decile. So you can arrange the data, find out average income per income class, average expenses, average savings, and notice from this particular data that the lower income levels actually are not saving. Okay, they're borrowing. Okay, whereas savings are more increased with the level of income. Very, very much consistent with Keynesian consumption theory. Okay, that you have a higher marginal propensity to save the higher the level of income. This data can be stylized in what is known as a Lorenz curve. Okay. Now in the Lorenz curve, okay, on the x-axis, you have the percentage of the households, and the y-axis, the percentage of income. Okay. So you have here that you have, say, 20% of the population, the ones with the lowest income level, earning roughly, say, 3% of total income. Okay. Then the 40% earn, say, about 11% of the total income. This is cumulative. Okay. This 40% that earn 11% already include the 20% that earn 3%. And the 60% of the population earn roughly 30%, okay, so on and so forth, until you get the top one, 100% of households earning 100% of the income. So that is what's called the Lorenz curve. Now, there are two interesting graphs here. There is the line of perfect equality and the line of complete inequality. In the line of perfect equality, that would mean that 20% of families have 20% of the income, 40% of 40%, 60% of 60% until we reach 100%. So that is the line of perfect equality, the 45-degree line. But there is the caked line of complete inequality, which is this blue line. Okay, shows to you that 20% of the households earn 0% of total income, 40% earn 0, 60 earn 0, 80 earn 0, then 100% now earn 100%. In other words, the top 20% earn all the income. So it's the line of complete inequality. Now, from the graphical point of view, what this means is The Lorenz curve of a country, okay, would be that the closer it is to the line of perfect equality, the more equitable is the distribution of income. The closer it is to the line of complete inequality, then the more inequitable the distribution of income. Okay. This, however, can be measured by a statistic known as the Gini coefficient. Because if you notice, the curve defines two areas, area A and area B. The Gini ratio is equal to the area of A over the area of A over the area of A plus B. Okay, so it's the area of A over the area of A plus B. Okay. Now, if you notice, if you're in the line of perfect equality, the area of A is 0. So your Gini ratio is 0. That's the lowest level of your Gini ratio. Now, if you look at the line of complete inequality, the area of B, which is this, in the line of complete inequality, the area of B is 0. So area of A over area of A plus B is equal to area of A over A equals 1. So the Gini ratio is a number between 0 and 1. It means that the closer the Gini ratio is to 1, the more inequitable the distribution of income. The closer the Gini ratio is to 0, the more equitable is the distribution of income. Okay. And these figures have already been computed. Here in the Philippines, the Gini ratio has been from 0.44 to 0.47 since 1985. Okay. Here it is. Okay. The Gini ratio, the Gini index, from 1988 to 2015 is always between 0.4 and 0.5. So the distribution of income in the Philippines has been more or less stable. And since the ratio here in the Philippines is about 0.45, 0.44, and the like, compared to other countries, it's quite average. Countries like Japan and many European countries would have ratios of 0.25. Countries in Latin America like Brazil, Mexico, have ratios of 0.66, 0.67. Okay. So there is greater equity in the distribution of income in the higher income countries of Western Europe and Japan, greater inequality in the distribution of income in Latin American countries. Though on average, they would have higher GNP per capita compared to the Philippines. Okay. And here you have the blue triangles representing the poverty incidence data. Okay. The green boxes, okay, also representing uh, the poverty incidence data from 2004. They call it refined because they changed the measurement of the food threshold from the protein requirement towards the 2,000 calories a day. And there has been a general decrease since 1980s. Okay. The trend has generally been towards a decrease, but of course it may have gone up last year because the pandemic induced major recession in the Philippine economy. Okay. Now, another important notion of poverty is what is known as your self-rated poverty. Okay. This self-rated poverty is not official. Okay. This is undertaken by private research organizations, and in the Philippines, it's done by the social weather stations. Okay. Now, the FIES is undertaken every 3 years, and it covers 30,000 households. Okay. Now, the self-rated poverty covers only 1,500 households, but they're able to process the data within 6 weeks, unlike the FIES, with a with the need to process huge amounts of data from 30,000 households. It takes about a year for the results to come out. Okay, which is why the self-rated data may not be as accurate, but it's immediate. Okay, it can track changes in a very short period of time because they only cover 1,500 households. So the results can come out within 6 weeks. There's a more greater sense of immediacy. Government has been trying to remedy this by having what's known as the annual poverty indicator survey. But here's the thing, really, the larger your sample, the more accurate it becomes, but the longer it takes to process it, unlike in the case of self-rated poverty. And that's why self-rated poverty data is seen as being informative. Okay. The self-rated poverty data involves a survey by asking households if they feel poorer now compared to before, if they've experienced hunger now compared to before. Okay. And although it's not official, it has been very, very influential. And so that's why one has to know that there are certain uses and limitations of this particular data set. Okay. And here, the trend here, if you notice, the red line is self-rated poverty. It shows wide fluctuations in the short run. But in the long run, it closely tracks the poverty incidence data, and that the self-rated poverty has decreased also from the Marcos years to the Duterte years. Okay. However, the self-rated poverty is always substantially much higher than the poverty incidence data. Okay. Then they also track moderate and severe hunger information. Okay. The final topic when I talk about poverty is the issue of social exclusion. It's already 8:04 and I'm already quite tired. So I'll discuss this together with neoclassical theories of economic development in the next class. All right. So, okay. So I suppose I can call it a night now. So good evening. I'll be sending you copies of this recording, right? So thank you very much again for your patience. I'll see you next week. Okay. Bye, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
My
Good evening
pleasure.
Thank
po.
you, sir.